How's it, everybody? That greeting will make sense as this episode goes on. I mentioned in my last episode that I was going to talk about racism, that very, very uncontroversial topic in the world right now. And I thought now is the time to have that discussion. Maybe not in the form people are imagining. I actually want to read a story. As a child in South Africa, I grew up with, I suppose, a very different upbringing than North America. You know, I grew up with the stories of Vusamazuly, Credo, Mutwa, and Herman Charles Bosman. And for those of you who don't know, Vusamazuly, Credo, Mutwa was a Zulu Sangoma, which people sometimes call a witch doctor, but he was a traditional healer, born in South Africa. He was born in, I think, July 1921. And he was an author of books that drew upon African mythology, traditional Zulu folklore, extraterrestrial encounters, and his own personal stories. And the two books that I grew up on were, one was called Africa is My Witness. I think that was published in 1964, maybe. I was born in 1965. And the other one was in Indaba, My Children, which may have been 1966, a year after my birth. Indaba, for those of you that don't know, is a Zulu word. The way I understood Indaba, my children, when I was a kid, is it meant, gather my children, come together, my children. There's a specific definition. I looked it up. It's an important conference held by leaders of the Zulu Xhosa people of South Africa. It's a problem or concern, or it's a council in which indigenous peoples of Southern Africa meet to discuss some important questions. So I want to meet and discuss important questions. So I was raised on, with very different mythologies compared to, American kids or Canadian kids. By the way, I discovered that about 74% of my audience is from North America, mostly the US, and then the next country is Canada. So that's really interesting. So this stuff is maybe new to a lot of you. So in South Africa, way back when, there was a word used by some South Africans about Black people. I'm not going to say the word because it's very much like the N word in America. So I'm going to call it the K word. I'll probably put in the show notes, specifically what the word is and, where it originally comes from. I think it's Arabic originally. But, in South Africa, you can be imprisoned for actually saying this word now. But more importantly than you can be imprisoned, it represents, decades of pain and abuse for Black people. So I don't want to use it anymore. I was thinking I should, just in the context of a historical discussion, but it's very hurtful. Terrible things were done to non-white people. I was a part of a group of filmmakers in the 80s who was making anti-apartheid films, and most of them were banned in our own country for many years. But it did get word out to the rest of the world. And the last film I made in South Africa was the musical Sarafina with Whoopi Goldberg. Really beautiful experience making it. Very painful film to watch, but I really recommend it because it also is it's a celebration of life in the midst of terrible, terrible pain. I do recommend seeing it. It's sort of a slice of life of some of the pain people endured, but it was a historical film about some of the school riots. 1976. Was I think the era we were shooting. Half of my people are Afrikaners, and there's an irony about the Afrikaners because the Afrikaners, during the Boer War, were put in concentration camps by the British. Was it the Boer War? Or was it another war? There were so many wars. I have no idea. And the British treated them really badly, concentration camps, and they would actually starve the women and children of the Afrikaans soldiers in order to break the spirit of the Afrikaners. And I always thought it was really interesting that then later the Afrikaners would then break the spirits of the Black and colored people, which was just strangely ironic to me and fucking tragic, frankly. So the other writer I mentioned that I grew up with, I didn't grow up with Disney at first. I mean, that came later, was Herman Charles Bosman. And I wrote it down here. He was born in 1905, and he died in 1951. And he's regarded as South Africa's, greatest short story writer. He studied the works of Edgar Allan Poe and Mark Twain, and he developed a style emphasizing the use of satire. And his English language works utilize primarily Afrikaner characters and highlight the many contradictions in Afrikaner society during sort of the first half of the 20th century. So there was one story in particular that really struck me that I want to read because it's all about racism. It's called Unto Dust. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of switch back to my early 20s self, because some of his short stories I read as monologues in drama and film school in South Africa. But I'm going to try and channel a much heavier South African accent. I didn't speak like this for the most part, but some of my family members did. So I'm going to channel a much heavier South African accent. I have noticed that when a young man or woman dies, people get the feeling that there is something beautiful and touching in the event, and that it's different from the death of an old person. In the thought, say, of a girl of 20 sinking into an untimely grave, there is a sweet wistfulness that makes people talk all kinds of romantic words. She died, they say, young. She that was so full of life and so fair. She was a flower that withered before it bloomed, they say. And it all seems so fitting and beautiful that there is a good deal of resentment at the funeral over the crude questions that a couple of men in plainclothes from the Landros's office are asking about cattle dip. But when you have grown old, nobody is very much interested in the manner of your dying. Nobody except you yourself, that is. And I think that your past life has got a lot to do with the way you feel when you get near the end of your days. I remember how, when he was lying in his deathbed, Andries Wessels kept on telling us that it was because of the blameless path he had trodden from his earliest years that he could compose himself in peace to lay down his burdens. And I certainly never saw a man breathe his last more tranquilly, seeing that right up to the end, he kept on murmuring to us how happy he was, with heavenly hosts and invisible choirs of angels all around him. Just before he died, he told us that the angels had become visible. They were medium-sized angels, he said, and they had cloven hoofs and carried forks. It was obvious that Andries Wessels' ideas were getting a bit confused by then. But all the same, I never saw a man die in a more hallowed sort of calm. Once during the malaria season in the Eastern Transvaal, it seemed to me, when I was in a high fever and like to die, that the whole world was a big burial ground. I thought it was the earth itself that was a graveyard, and not just those little fenced-in bits of land dotted with tombstones in the shade of a Western Province oak tree or by the side of a Transvaal koppie. This was a nightmare that worried me a great deal, and so I was very glad, when I recovered from the fever, to think that we Boers had properly marked out places on our farms for white people to be laid to rest in a civilized Christian way, instead of having to be buried just anyhow, along with a dead wild cat maybe, or a bushman with a clay pot and things. Now, I just want to take a quick pause here and let you know that I will be using the K word instead of the actual word, as we get into the next part of the story. When I mentioned this to my friend Stoffel Oosthuizen, who was in the Low Country with me at the time, he agreed with me wholeheartedly. There were people who talked in a high-flown way of death as the great leveler, he said. And those high-flown people also declared that everyone was made kin by death. He would still like to see those things proved, Stoffel Oosthuizen said. After all, that was one of the reasons why the Boers trekked away into the Transvaal and the Free State, he said, because the British government wanted to give the vote to any Cape-coloured person walking about with a crusade and big cracks in his feet. The first time he heard that sort of talk about death coming to all of us alike and making us all equal, Stoffel Oosthuizen's suspicions were aroused. It sounded like out of a speech made by one of those liberal Cape politicians, he explained. I found something very comforting in Stoffel Oosthuizen's words. Then, to illustrate his contention, Stoffel Oosthuizen told me a story of an incident that took place in a bygone Transvaal K-war. I don't know whether he told the story incorrectly, or whether it was just that kind of story. But by the time he had finished, all my uncertainties had, I discovered, come back to me. You can go and look at Hans Wellman's tombstone any time you het niet verdient, Stoffel Oosthuizen said. The slab of red sandstone is weathered by now, of course, seeing how long ago it all happened, but the inscription is still legible. I was with Hans Wellman on that morning when he fell. Our commando had been ambushed by the K's and was retreating. I could do nothing for Hans Wellman. Once, when I looked around, I saw a tall K bending over him and plunging an assegai into him. Shortly afterwards, I saw the K stripping the clothes off of Hans Wellman. A yellow K-dog was yelping excitedly around his black master. Although I was in grave danger myself, with several dozen Ks making straight for me on foot through the bush, the fury I felt at the sight of what that tall K was doing made me hazard a last shot. Reining in my horse and taking what aim I could under the circumstances, I pressed the trigger. My luck was in. I saw the K fall forward beside the naked body of Hans Wellman. Then I set spurs to my horse and I galloped off at full speed, with the foremost of my pursuers already almost upon me. The last I saw was the yellow dog bounding up to his master, whom I had wounded mortally, as we were to discover later. As you know, that K-war dragged on for a long time. There were few pitched battles. Mainly what took place were bush skirmishes like the one in which Hans Wellman lost his life. After about 6 months, quiet of a sort was restored to the Mariku and Soutpansberg districts. Then the day came when I went out, in company of a handful of other burgers, to fetch in the remains of Hans Wellman, at his widow's request, for burial in the little cemetery plot on the farm. We took a coffin with us on a Cape cart. We located the scene of the skirmish without difficulty. Indeed, Hans Wellman had been killed not very far from his own farm, which had been temporarily abandoned together with the other farms in that part during the time that the trouble with the K's had lasted. We drove up to the spot where I remembered having seen Hans Wellman lying dead on the ground, with the tall K next to him. From a distance, I again saw that yellow dog. He slipped away into the bush at our approach. I could not help feeling that there was something rather stirring about that beast's fidelity, even though it was bestowed on a dead K. We were now confronted with a queer situation. We found that what was left of Hans Wellman and the K consisted of little more than pieces of sun-dried flesh and the dismembered fragments of bleached skeletons. The sun and the wind and animals and birds of prey had done their work. There was a heap of human bones with here and there leathery strips of blackened flesh. But we could not tell which was the white man and which the K. To make it still more confusing, a lot of bones were missing altogether, having no doubt been dragged away by wild animals into their lairs in the bush. Another thing was that Hans Wellman and that K had been just about the same size. Stoffel Oosthuizen paused in his narrative, and I let my imagination dwell for a moment on that situation. And I realized just how those Boers must have felt about it. About the thought of bringing the remains of a Transvaal burger home to his widow for Christian burial, and perhaps having a lot of K-bones mixed up with the burger, lying with him in the same tomb on which the mauve petals from the oleander overhead would fall. I remember one of our party saying that was the worst of these K wars, Stoffel Oosthuizen continued. If it had been a war against the English, and a part of a dead Englishman had got lifted into that coffin by mistake, it wouldn't have mattered so much, he said. There seemed to me in this story to be something as strange as the African felt. Stoffel Oosthuizen said that the little party of Boers spent almost a whole afternoon with the remains in order to try to get the white man sorted out from the K. By the evening, they had laid all they could find of what seemed like Hans Wellman's bones into the coffin in the Cape cart. The rest of the bones and flesh they buried on the spot. Stoffel Oosthuizen added that no matter what the difference in the color of their skin had been, it was impossible to say that the K's bones were less white than Hans Wellman's. Nor was it possible to say that the K's sun-dried flesh was any blacker than the white man's. Alive, you couldn't go wrong in distinguishing between a white man and a K. Dead, you had a great difficulty in telling them apart. Naturally, we burgers felt very bitter about this whole affair, Stoffel Oosthuizen said. And our resentment was something that we couldn't explain quite. Afterwards, several other men who were there that day told me that they had the same feelings of suppressed anger that I did. They wanted somebody, just once, to make a remark such as, "In death they were not divided." Then you would have seen an outburst all right. Nobody said anything like that, however. We all knew better. 2 days later, a funeral service was conducted in a little cemetery on the Velman farm. And shortly afterwards, the sandstone memorial was erected that you can still see there. That was the story Stoffel Oosthuizen told me after I'd recovered from the fever. It was a story that, as I've said, had in it features as strange as the African felt. But it brought me no peace in my broodings after that attack of malaria, especially when Stoffel Oosthuizen spoke of how he had, on occasion, one clear night, when the stars shone, to pass that quiet graveyard on the Velman farm. Something leapt up from the mound beside the sandstone slab. It gave him quite a turn, Stoffel Oosthuizen said. For the third time, and in that way, to come across that yellow gay dog. Wow. I feel more emotional telling that story than I thought I would. And I think it's because reading this as a child really helped me see how insane the Afrikaners' perspective of apartheid was. And I was very, very fortunate that I grew up in a family. My grandfather was the one that had these books, and my mother was the black sheep of the family. So I grew up with part of my family very much aware of the problems, in South Africa. And what's so brilliant about the story is it's a story written by an Afrikaner to enlighten or try and wake up the Afrikaners. And it was a profound story to me because it really revealed the stupidity of apartheid. But it was a Trojan horse for racist South Africans because it was funny and it was poking fun at their things, and mixed in was this profound story that showed how none of it made sense. Their beliefs didn't make sense. And by the way, please understand, not all South Africans were racists. Generally speaking, we say that the Afrikaners were more traditional and tended to be more racist. My personal experience is that was generally true. But please understand, not every South African was a racist. But I think the thing I loved was, he was making fun of this really minority attitude, that somehow the black and the white man had to be separated, and the truth is, in death you couldn't tell the difference. So why the story? Besides the fact that I love the story, because it got me thinking about present day America. When I got to America, when I was probably 12, 13, Canada and America, I remember being in New York one day and I saw this commercial. Some of you that are older might remember it. It was a commercial about the Great American Melting Pot. It was this pot and all the different colors and nationalities and religions were going into the pot. And the whole idea was it didn't matter, where you were from or what your genetics were, you were an American now. And that was the ideal. And I loved that. And especially coming from South Africa, where the focus was constantly on the differences between people. It was in the law books. I mean, my very first ID, I have to find it wherever it is, literally has a piece of paper in there that says, Mark Anthony Vicente is classified as a white person. I mean, it was fucking insane. But, back to America, North America, it all seems to have changed now. Because now the messaging is that we must focus on racial differences. And it makes me wonder, so this story I just told, this anti-racist story, is this now a bad story? Is it no longer, kosher? Does this go against the current, important narrative? Will people now say, like, how dare you tell a story to suggest that the races are equal? Like, how dare you do that? And so the question is, should this story be banned? Because this story from way back when, from the late 50s and 60s, should it be banned? The idea that, that there is equality. And people say, well, there isn't equality. So yes, you shouldn't read these stories. And as I said, I think 74, 75% of my audience is in North America. So this discussion might be exceptionally triggering for some of my audience. We are responsible for our triggers, you know what I'm saying? We are. You can think rationally and feel rationally and understand that this is my perspective, and you don't have to destroy me for my perspective, and I don't have to destroy you for yours. But a lot of the messaging right now is that in order to make right the past, we have to invert everything to create racial equity. And so some of what that amounts to is, the equivalent of, well, all white people are scum. Everybody else is beyond reproach. All white people are scum. Okay. All right. I certainly understand that perspective. But then I do have a number of questions that I keep asking myself, and I've been mulling this over. And the questions I have is, how many generations do the descendants of perpetrators need to be vilified? Is it 3 generations? Is it 10 generations? 20 generations? Is it 1,000 years? And then if these scum are suppressed by the suppressors, does that mean that the suppressors will have to pay a similar debt later that they're currently extracting from the previous suppressors? Is the solution to invert racism? And okay, so if it is, then how long? How long should the racism be inverted? And then what do we do with the Black Africans who sold their own people into slavery? What do we do with the Maoist regimes and all the people in the Maoist regimes that killed millions? Well, and what do we do with the Russians that sent their own people to the gulags in the millions? So who should pay, and how should they pay? And then who's going to be the group that's analyzing all this and telling us who must and who must not suffer? It's weird, like back to South Africa. Many people who think that they're pure white are not. And many people who thought they're pure white. I don't think it's so much of a big deal now, but certainly pre-90s, it was a big deal to some people. But the funny thing is, Afrikaners are reported to have anywhere between 10 and 19% black, quote unquote, black in them. And I see that in my own family, just, that we have a few members that are pretty dark. And I'm like, yeah, there it is. And let's just say that there was a lot of raping and pillaging that happened in South Africa when the British and Dutch arrived, in Southern Africa, before it was South Africa. South Africa is a lot more genetically iffy than people may realize. So now, back to North America. So in North America, should we all be going for genetic testing to see who should be held accountable for the sins of the past and who shouldn't be held accountable? If a careful analysis was done on me and it was found that I had, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 10 or 15% quote unquote black in me, what has to be done with me? Should the blackness be extracted from me? For those of you that have read Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, and then the remaining 85% be sent to a concentration camp? These are important questions. And by the way, questions, I don't have answers for any of these questions. This is just stuff I'm thinking about. I don't have a solution for this. But I think it's worth thinking about, and where does this story that I just read you, that I love because it was a brilliant Trojan horse for the Afrikaner, brilliant. Where does this story fit in our modern day world with all the narratives about what has to be done to resolve racism? Where does the story fit? Is it a bad story? Is it a good story for its time, but now it's a bad story? Should it be banned? Anyway, I do hope you enjoyed the story that I read. I do think it was a brilliant attempt to wake people up who were stuck in a very foolish system of thinking. As always, please, I beg of you, stay curious.